He pushed the door with 2 fingers. Inside, flour lay white across the floorboards like snow, and through that snow ran a long red drag mark, straight back toward the rear room. No smoke from the chimney. No wind. The front door unlocked, though that lock was the thing the old man had been prouder of than any rifle he ever built. The copper smell closed his throat, before his brain could name it. His hand slid down to his revolver. Boots crushed broken glass. Shelves knocked flat, sacks split open, and in the middle of it all a shape lying face down, still in the way only the dead are still. Then he heard it. Behind the storeroom door. Breathing. Wet. Ragged. The sound of someone trying not to make a sound, and losing that fight one breath at a time. The frame around the latch was split outward. Wedged shut from the inside. He stepped back. Then drove his boot into the door. The mountain let him go before dawn. It always did that. Never asked him to stay. Never begged him to leave. Just opened up ahead of him, gray and cold, and let him ride down, into whatever the valley had waiting. Emmett Wilder had been riding down out of high country for 11 years now. Same trail. Same silence. Same sound of his horse's breath fogging in the dark, over and over, like a clock, that only knew 1 hour. 11 years since he'd built anything, with his own 2 hands, that wasn't a trap line, or a lean-to. 11 years since Stonebrick had been nothing, but rocks and stubborn grass, and a dream he wasn't sure he believed in yet. He believed in it now. Believed in it the way a man believes in his own scars. Because he'd earned every acre. Because nobody had handed him a single foot of that land. Because he'd trapped, and skinned and near frozen to death 3 winters running just to buy the first parcel, and then he'd done it again. And again. Until the ranch stopped being a dream, and started being a fact. That was the thing about facts. They didn't care what they cost you. Josephine used to say that. Not about the ranch. About everything. He shook the thought off. Old habit. Like flicking water off his hands. Because thinking about Josephine, before sunrise never ended anywhere good. It just circled. Started at her laugh, and ended at a ravine 3 miles east of Gallows Creek. And he'd walked that circle so many times now he could have done it blindfolded, which was its own kind of curse. So he didn't walk it. Not this morning. This morning he had business. Kestrel's post sat, where the road split, half a day's ride, from Stonebrick, tucked against the foothills like it was hiding from something. Emmett had ordered a rifle, from the old man 3 months back. Custom stock. His initials burned into the wood. A vanity, maybe. The kind of thing a man bought once in his life, and never had to explain to anybody. Silas Kestrel was supposed to have it ready. Along with winter stores. Flour. Salt. Powder. The things a ranch couldn't grow out of the ground no matter how hard a man worked it. Routine. That was the word Emmett kept turning over as he rode. Routine business. The kind of errand his foreman could have handled easy. Except Emmett liked the ride. Liked 2 hours of nothing, but hoofbeats and his own thoughts, which, most days, was the only company he could stand. Most days. The light turned gold just as the post came into view. Squat building. Log walls gone silver with age. A corral out front, empty. No smoke. Emmett reined up. Sat there a second, just looking. Kestrel always had a fire going this time of year. Always. Man was 70, if he was a day, complained about the cold like it owed him money personally. No smoke meant no fire. No fire meant something was wrong. And Emmett had lived in wild country long enough to trust that feeling in his gut, before he trusted anything his eyes told him. He tied off. stood there listening. Nothing. Not even wind. The door was unlocked. That was the second wrong thing. Kestrel locked up every night, since drifters cleaned him out 2 winters back. Wouldn't even step outside to relieve himself, without turning the key first. Man was proud of that lock. Talked about it more than he ever talked about his rifles, which was saying something. Emmett pushed the door open with 2 fingers. The smell hit him before his eyes adjusted. Copper. And under it, something worse. Something that closed the back of his throat, before his brain had even named it. Kestrel. His voice sounded small in that ruined little room. Shelves knocked flat. Sacks split open, flour dusted across the floorboards like the world's ugliest snowfall. And in the middle of it, face down, a shape that used to be a person. Emmett didn't need to check for a pulse. He'd seen enough death in the mountains, animal and otherwise, to know it on sight. The stillness of it. The way a body stopped looking like a body, and started looking like laundry somebody dropped, and never came back for. Kestrel's throat had been opened ear to ear. Deep enough that whoever did it hadn't been in a hurry. Hadn't been scared. Had taken their time, maybe even enjoyed it, and that thought alone put Emmett's hand on his revolver, before his brain had caught up with the decision. He crossed the room slow. Boots crunching glass. Because you didn't survive 11 winters in high country by being squeamish. You survived by making yourself look. Really look. At the thing you didn't want to see. Until it stopped having power over you. He looked. And that's when he heard it. A sound from the back room. Small. Could have been wind working a loose board. Except it wasn't wind. It was breathing. Wet. Ragged. Like something trying not to make noise, and losing that fight one breath at a time. Emmett's hand tightened on the gun. He moved to the storeroom door. Locked. But the frame around the latch was split outward. Splintered like somebody had wedged it shut, from the inside, not the outside. Somebody hiding. Not somebody hidden away. Anybody in there? The breathing stopped. Then a voice. Barely there. Stay away. A woman. Emmett holstered the revolver. Pulled his knife instead. 3 hard kicks, and the hinges tore loose, from wood gone soft with rot. The storeroom sat dark. One high window, a blade of light cutting sideways through dust. It took his eyes a second. When they adjusted, he almost wished they hadn't. She was pressed against the far wall, half hidden behind crates of ammunition. A big woman. Broad through the shoulders, and thick through the arms, the kind of build that looked like it had done real work its whole life, strong-looking, even folded up small the way she was, even beaten the way she was. Riding clothes torn to rags. One eye swollen shut. Lips split, crusted dark. And under all of it, under the blood, and the bruises, there was something in the set of her jaw, that told Emmett this woman had spent her whole life being underestimated, and had made peace with letting people find out different the hard way. Her shoulder. Someone had branded her. Raw. Blistered. Still weeping at the edges. A circle, 2 lines crossed through the center. Emmett knew that mark. Everybody in the territory knew that mark, even if most folks pretended they didn't. The wolf's ring. Don't, she said again, trying to push herself up, and failing, her arm buckling under her like it had forgotten how to carry weight. Don't. They'll come back. Emmett knelt. Slow. Hands where she could see them. Up close the damage kept going. Rope burns at her wrists. Bruises ringing her throat in the shape of fingers. Boot prints on her ribs, dark and swollen, the kind that meant something was broken under there. This hadn't been quick. They'd taken their time with her too. Like her size had made them angrier somehow. Like breaking something that looked unbreakable was the whole point of the exercise. "They're gone," Emmett said. Kept his voice low. Steady. The same voice he used on spooked horses, though he'd never admit that to anybody, least of all her. "It's just me. Name's Emmett Wilder. I'm going to get you out of here." She stared at him, with the one eye that still worked. For a second he thought she'd fight him. Thought she had just enough left in her to try, and something in her face said she'd tried plenty already tonight, and hadn't stopped once. Then something in her gave way. "Hazel," she whispered. "Hazel Merrick." Getting her onto his horse took longer than it should have. She was strong, he could feel, that even through the pain, the way her whole frame fought to hold itself together even, when every movement made her gasp, but strong didn't mean whole. Every lift made her bite down on a scream. Emmett had seen men kicked by horses, who looked better than she did right now. He'd buried 2 of them. He didn't take her toward town. Couldn't. The nearest doctor sat in Gallows Creek, and Gallows Creek belonged to men, who took their orders, from the Wolf's Ring same, as everybody else in that miserable stretch of country. Sheriff Wyatt Cross wore a badge, and did their bidding, and everybody knew it, and nobody said it, because saying it out loud got a man killed slow. Taking Hazel there would be handing her right back to whoever did this. So Emmett turned north. Toward Stonebrook. Toward Agnes Poole, who'd nursed wounded men, through a war, before she ever nursed cattle, and who could patch a person up, without asking questions, that didn't need answering yet. 3 hours. Hazel didn't talk. Just gripped the saddle horn white-knuckled, and breathed through her teeth, and twice she went limp against him, and both times his heart stopped, until he felt her breath against his arm again. By the time Stonebrook came into view, the sun sat high and merciless. The ranch spread out below the ridge, not grand, not the kind of place men wrote stories about, but solid. Built plank by plank, stone by stone, by a man, who used to sleep in caves for a living. Corrals. A long low house. Barns that didn't leak. Everything Emmett had built, with hands that still carried the scars of trap lines, and skinning knives. He shouted for Agnes, before he'd even swung down out of the saddle. She came at a run, wiping flour off her hands, onto her apron, and stopped dead in the yard, when she saw what he was carrying. "Lord above." Agnes's voice cracked. "What happened?" "Wolf's Ring." 2 words. That was all it took. Agnes's face went hard as flint. "Get her inside," she said. "Now." Hazel woke to clean sheets, and the smell of carbolic soap, and for one blessed second she didn't remember anything at all. Then the pain arrived. Sharp. Total. Like somebody had traded her blood for broken glass. And with it came the memory. The outpost. Duke Kessler's hands around her throat, and his voice, before that, laughing about her size, saying a woman built like her ought to have been able to fight harder, ought to have lasted longer, and wasn't it a shame she hadn't. The brand searing into her shoulder, while Ezra Cade watched, and smiled like a man enjoying a Sunday supper. She tried to sit up. Regretted it instantly. A voice, calm, steady, older, said, "Don't." Hazel froze. The woman sat in a chair by the bed, lamplight carving shadows, into a face that had clearly seen too much to be shocked by anything anymore. "You're safe," the woman said. "Name's Agnes. You're at Stonebrook. Mr. Wilder brought you in 2 days back." 2 days. Hazel's throat felt like sand. "Where is he?" "Downstairs." Agnes set aside a bowl of water. "He'll want to know you're awake. But first I've got to look at that shoulder. It's infected. Been fighting it, but it needs watching close." Hazel looked down at the bandage. "Tight. Careful." Someone had taken real care with it. The man who brought me here, she said slowly. Emmett Wilder. Who is he? Agnes's mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost not. You really don't know. Should I? Richest man in 3 counties. Owns more grazing land than some folks own opinions. She stood, smoothing her skirts. If you'd told me a week ago, that Emmett Wilder would ride into a murder scene, and carry a bleeding stranger out on his own horse, a woman near his own size, and wait, mind you, no small thing to haul across a saddle for 3 hours, I'd have called you a liar. A pause. But here we are. She left before Hazel could ask anything else. Hazel lay back and stared at the ceiling. The room was fine. Too fine. A quilt stitched, with more care than her whole childhood had gotten. A rug that probably cost more than her family's farm had ever earned in a year. The kind of room where people like her didn't belong. The kind of room where nobody had ever once looked at her, and seen only her size, before they saw the rest of her. Footsteps on the stairs. The door opened, and Emmett Wilder walked in, and Hazel understood, in one look, why the word mountain kept attaching itself to him in her mind even, though nobody had said it. Tall. Broad through the shoulders in a way that came from labor, not luxury. Beard rough and unkempt, streaked here and there, with early gray. Hands scarred, real scars, working scars, the kind that came, before money, not after it. He didn't look like wealth. He looked like a man who'd earned every hard thing he owned, one winter at a time, and he was looking at her now the way he probably looked at good land. Like there was something worth respecting underneath the surface, and he wasn't in any hurry to pretend otherwise. Miss Merrick. His voice was low. Steady. A voice that didn't waste words on things it didn't mean. How are you feeling? Hazel almost laughed. It came out a cough instead. Like I got dragged behind a horse for 10 miles. A breath. Alive, though. Thank you. Don't need to thank me. Emmett pulled a chair close, sat, elbows on his knees. Any decent person would have done the same. No. Hazel's voice went flat. They wouldn't. Not when the wolf's ring is involved. Most men see a woman my size laid out like that and figure I did something to bring it on myself. Figure a woman built strong enough to work fields ought to have been strong enough to fight her way out. Something moved fast across Emmett's face. Anger, maybe. Gone before it settled anywhere. That's not how I see it, he said. I know. That's why I'm still talking to you. Tell me what happened. So she did. Not all of it. Not yet. But enough. How she and her brother Eli had been riding toward the mining camps, chasing work, chasing something better than the nothing they'd had before. How they'd stopped in Gallows Creek for supplies. How a man in that saloon had looked at Hazel, and made a joke about her size in front of the whole room, the kind of joke men made, when they wanted to feel bigger by making somebody else smaller. How Abel Cade had laughed loudest. How Eli had put himself between her and Abel's hands, when the joke turned into something worse. How Abel had smiled about it. Said he'd remember that. 3 nights later, riders came into their camp in the dark. Dragged Eli off his bedroll. Beat him until he couldn't stand. Took him. Hazel tried to follow. Tried to fight. Woke up in a basement that smelled like old blood and older fear. 2 weeks, Hazel said. Her voice had gone mechanical, flat, the voice of somebody reciting a fact instead of living it. Duke Kessler. He's their enforcer. Wanted to break me. Make me, her hand drifted to the bandage, compliant. That's the word he used. Compliant. Told me a woman my size ought to be easier to break than most, since I had more of me to hurt. He was wrong about that. It just took him longer. Emmett's face had gone very still. And your brother? Hazel closed her eyes. They killed him slow. Ezra Cade, that's the one runs the whole operation, made me watch. Called it a lesson. The room went quiet except for a clock ticking somewhere down the hall. Why'd they leave you alive? Emmett asked, finally. Don't know. Hazel opened her eyes. Maybe they got bored. Maybe they figured I'd run, and they could hunt me down whenever they felt like it. A breath. Or maybe they just wanted me to keep suffering a little longer. Emmett stood. Walked to the window. Stood there a long moment, looking out at his land, his cattle, everything he'd built, with his own hands spread out under an indifferent sky. The Wolf's Ring, he said quietly, has been running in this territory 8 years. Started small. Protection money. Claim jumping. Then they got smart. Started buying people instead of just robbing them. Lawmen. Judges. Freight companies. He turned to face her. Now they move people like cattle, and nobody can touch them, because half this territory answers to them one way or another. Hazel stared at him. I've been trying to bring them down 3 years, Emmett said. Ever since they killed my wife. The words landed heavier than he probably meant them to. Your wife? Josephine. His voice didn't rise, didn't crack, but his hands closed, into fists at his sides, slow and involuntary, like something his body did, without asking permission. She ran a mission for women who'd been trafficked through here. Found evidence, a whole route the ring was using. Freight cars, false compartments, cattle manifests that weren't cattle at all. His jaw tightened. She brought it to Sheriff Cross. Thought he'd help her. He didn't. He went straight to Ezra Cade. Emmett's voice went flat, the way a man's voice goes flat, when the alternative is breaking. They found her body 3 days later. Bottom of a ravine. Made it look like her horse threw her. I'm sorry, Hazel said, and meant it. Emmett shook his head. Moved back to the chair. Sat, elbows on his knees again, like the weight of standing had gotten to be too much. I tried everything after that. Investigators. Lawyers. Wrote letters to the territorial governor, that never got answered. Nothing worked. Their reach goes too deep. He looked at her. Miss Merrick, Hazel, I didn't bring you here just to be kind. I brought you here, because you've seen inside their operation. You know their faces. Their routines. Where they keep people. What are you saying? It wasn't a question. Not really. I'm saying I can give you a safe place. Resources. Whatever you need to heal. A pause. And in exchange, I want to burn it down. All of it. And I need somebody who's been inside to help me do it. Hazel looked at him a long moment. This man with his fine house, and his empty side of the bed, and his hands still scarred, from a life, before all of it. He was offering her a deal. Revenge, dressed up as partnership. Smart. Also dangerous. The Wolf's Ring didn't forgive. Didn't forget. Going after them meant all the way, or not at all. But then. Her hands were already stained. 2 men dead in that back room at Kestrel's, though she hadn't told him that part yet. There wasn't a version of her life anymore that didn't end in blood, one way or another. I want Ezra Cade dead, she said. I want Abel dead. I want Duke Kessler dead. All 3 of them. Not 2 out of 3. Not close enough. All 3, or this deal means nothing to me. Then we agree. Not yet. Hazel pushed herself upright, ignoring the scream in her ribs. I need to know why. Really why? You could take your money, and go somewhere civilized. Why stay here, and fight a war you might not win? Emmett was quiet a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had gone raw in a way it hadn't been before. Because the night, before Josephine died, she told me, if something happens to me, don't let them win. Don't let them keep doing this. He met Hazel's eyes. I've broken a lot of promises in my life. Not that one. Never that one. Hazel nodded, slow. All right. Then here's my deal. You give me what I need, guns, information, a place to plan. And when the time comes, you don't get in my way. I'm not your hired gun. Her chin lifted. I'm your partner. Equal stakes. Emmett stood. Extended his hand. Equal stakes. Hazel took it. His grip was firm, calloused despite everything he owned. The grip of a man who'd built something, before money ever came into it. Her own grip matched his, and she watched something register in his eyes, when it did. Surprise, maybe. Not at her strength. At the fact, that he hadn't expected anything less. One more thing, Hazel said. I'm going to kill them. Not capture. Not hand them to some bought sheriff to let walk. Kill. If that's a problem for you. It's not. And just like that, something started that neither of them could take back. 3 days later, Emmett rode back out to Kestrel's post to bury the old man. He hadn't planned to go alone. Hazel wasn't strong enough, yet to ride that far, and Agnes had made her opinion about the trip known in language that would have curled the ears of most men. But some things a person had to do by himself. Burying a man, who might have died, because of what he knew, that was one of them. The post sat exactly as they'd left it. Silent. Wrong. Flowers still dusted across the floor like old snow, that refused to melt. Emmett worked through the afternoon. Dug the grave out back, under a cottonwood, that had probably shaded that spot since, before the post existed. Wrapped Kestrel's body himself. Said a few words, that felt small against the size of what had happened in that room. Then he went back inside for the rifle. It had been sitting behind the counter the whole time, untouched. Whoever tore this place apart hadn't cared about a custom-made Winchester, with somebody else's initials on the stock. Emmett lifted it. Turned it over in his hands. Felt the weight of it, the careful work Kestrel had put into the engraving. And that's when he noticed the seam. A hairline gap along the underside of the stock. Wrong. Not part of the design. Emmett had handled enough rifles in his life to know a factory line, from a tampered one, and this had been opened. Recently. He worked his knife blade into the seam. Careful. A small panel gave way. Inside, folded tight into a square smaller than a playing card, was a page. Handwriting he knew. Handwriting he'd have known blindfolded, in the dark, after 100 years. Josephine's. His hands went unsteady in a way they hadn't gone in years. The page was dated 4 months before she died. Silas, the shipment records match what I told you. 3 routes, all filed under false livestock manifests. I need somewhere safe to keep the originals, until I can get them to someone who isn't already bought. You're the only one left I trust. Emmett read it twice. Then a third time. Like the words might change, if he stared hard enough. Kestrel hadn't been some old man, who happened to sell him a rifle 3 months back. Kestrel had been helping Josephine. Hiding evidence for her. And he'd kept that secret buried in a rifle stock for 3 years, waiting for a day that never came, because somebody had walked into his post and opened his throat before he ever got the chance to hand it over. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was a silencing. Somebody had known Kestrel was sitting on something. Somebody had come looking. And Emmett, riding down out of the mountains, that morning for a routine errand, thinking about nothing but flour and cartridges, had walked straight into the middle of it, 3 years too late to save the man, and just in time to save the woman hiding behind his crates. He sat down on an overturned barrel in the ruined little store, and let that settle into his chest like a stone dropping into still water. Josephine hadn't just stumbled onto that trafficking route by accident. She'd been building a case. Piece by piece. Person by person. Kestrel had been one piece. There would be others. Other names, other hiding places, other people who might still be alive, still holding fragments of what she'd known, before somebody threw her body into a ravine and called it an accident. Emmett folded the page back into its square. Tucked it inside his coat, close to his chest, like it might slip away from him if he wasn't careful. Then he rode home faster than the trail really allowed. He found Hazel on the porch, when he got back, propped in a chair Agnes had dragged out for her, a blanket over her knees despite the warm afternoon. She looked better than she had 3 days ago. Not well. Better. She saw his face, before he said a word. What happened? Not a question. She'd stopped asking questions like questions days ago. Everything out of her mouth landed like a demand now, like the world owed her straight answers, and she intended to collect. Emmett handed her the folded page, without a word. She read it. Read it again. Looked up at him. Your wife knew about the routes. She was building something. Emmett's voice came out rough. 3 years ago. And whoever's running things now, they're still using the same routes. Which means she was right. Which means somebody's been sitting on that truth for 3 years, scared to say anything, until somebody finally shut them up for good. Which means there might be others, Hazel said. Other people she talked to. Other pieces. Which means we're not starting from nothing. Emmett sat down heavy in the chair beside her. We're starting from where she left off. Hazel looked down at the page again. At handwriting belonging to a dead woman neither of them could bring back, no matter how much fire they put into the trying. Then we find the rest of it, she said. Whatever she was building. We finish it. Emmett nodded. Didn't trust his voice for a second. We finish it, he agreed. The next 2 weeks moved slow and deliberate, the way real healing always does. By the end of the first week the swelling had mostly gone out of Hazel's face. By the 10th day the worst of the bruising had faded, from black to a sickly yellow-green, that Agnes said meant the body was doing its job. And by the 14th day, exactly 2 weeks, from the morning Emmett found her, Hazel could stand unaided, walk the length of the hallway, without gasping, and sit through a full evening in the study, without her ribs screaming about it. That was the day she stopped hating the brand on her shoulder, and started using it instead. Let it remind her, every morning, exactly why she was still breathing, and exactly what she owed the people who'd put it there. Emmett gave her the run of the ranch, as much as her body allowed. Told the hands she was a cousin recovering from illness. Nobody questioned it. Men who worked for Emmett Wilder learned early not to ask questions he hadn't offered to answer. In the evenings, after the work was done, and Agnes had gone to her own quarters, Emmett and Hazel sat in his study, with a lamp between them, and started building something out of grief. The study was a plain room for a man of his wealth. One wall of books, most of them practical, livestock, land law, the kind of reading a self-made man does to keep from getting cheated by smarter-sounding men in nicer suits. Another wall covered in maps, hand-drawn and annotated, freight routes and water rights inked in his own careful hand. A third wall held one photograph. A woman with dark hair and a steady gaze, dressed plain despite whatever money might have bought her otherwise. Josephine Wilder. The promise, hanging on a wall, watching everything that happened underneath it. Tell me about the ranch, Emmett said, one of those nights, whiskey untouched in front of him. The one where they kept you. Hazel closed her eyes. Pulled the memory up the way you pull a splinter, slow, because fast just tears more. North of Gallows Creek. Maybe 15 miles, up where the pines get thick. Looks like any other cattle spread, from the road. Corrals. Bunkhouse. Big lodge up front. A breath. But underneath, there's a second level. Dug right into the hillside. That's where they keep people. That's where they took Eli. Emmett's pen scratched steady across paper. How many men? 20, maybe, when I was there. Some just ranch hands, who don't ask what's happening below their boots. Others, she shuddered, small, involuntary, others enjoy the work. Duke's crew. Guards. 2 at the main gate. 1 at the tunnel that leads down. More on transport days. Transport days? Hazel nodded. Every 2 weeks they move people. Load them into wagons dressed up, as supply runs. Take them to the depot at, she frowned, dragging the name up, from somewhere buried, Coldwater Junction. Shipped east from there. Silas never told me, where exactly, and I never got close enough to find out on my own. Emmett's pen stopped. Coldwater Junction, he said slowly, runs freight through contracts filed under my name. Hazel looked at him. I know, she said quietly. I heard them talking, back in that basement. They use your wagons, Emmett. Your paperwork. You're the cover, and you didn't even know it. His face went through several things at once. White, then something closer to red. The color of a man trying not to break furniture, with his bare hands. How long, he said, has this been happening? I don't know. Before I ever got there. Emmett stood. Walked to the window. Stars were coming out, over the valley, cold and indifferent, same as always. I've been funding them, he said, so quiet it barely qualified as speech. This whole time. Every wagon that's ever rolled out of my land, with my name stamped on the side, I've been helping them do it. He turned. Did Josephine know? I don't know, Hazel said, honest. If she was already investigating them, maybe she figured it out. Maybe that's part of what got her killed. Emmett's hands were shaking. Hazel had never seen a man look so furious and so hollowed out in the same breath. We end this, he said. Whatever it costs me. Every contract. Every dollar. I don't care. He looked at her, and something in his face had gone permanent, gone past the point where a man changes his mind. We end this. Good, Hazel said. Because I'm not stopping, until every last one of them is in the ground. Word spread quietly, the way word spreads among people who've all lost the same kind of thing to the same kind of monster. A blacksmith named Otis Crane showed up first. One eye gone, a daughter gone, with it 2 years back, taken and never seen again. He looked at Hazel's size, and her scars for exactly, as long as it took him to size up whether she'd hold her own, and then he never brought either up again, which was the closest thing to respect the man knew how to offer. When do we start, he said. A woman named Nell Sawyer arrived 2 days after. Lean, quick-eyed, missing 2 fingers on her left hand, from her time working explosives during the war, before her husband got caught stealing, from the wrong people, and paid for it on his own barn door. She heard what Emmett was building, and said, heard you might need somebody good with dynamite. Several somethings, Emmett said. Nell smiled, and it wasn't a comfortable thing to look at. Then I'm in. Others trickled in over the following days. A drifter named Witt, whose family farm had burned, because it sat on land the ring wanted. A young woman, Rosa, sold into the ring's operation at 15, who'd escaped at 19 carrying knife scars, and a hatred sharp enough to cut glass. A tracker called Silent Crow, who said almost nothing about why he wanted the ring gone, but whose aim with a rifle spoke plainly enough on its own. None of them soldiers. None of them heroes, not in the storybook sense. Just people the ring had chewed up, and thrown away, who'd refused, against every reasonable odd, to actually die. Emmett gave them what they needed. Weapons from his own stores. Horses from his stables. A bunkhouse set back, from the main house, where they could plan, without prying eyes. Not much money, but enough. Food. Shelter. Something that had started to look, uncomfortably, like purpose. On the first morning of real drilling, we'd made the mistake of assuming Hazel would slow the group down. Said it out loud, even, half a joke, the kind men made, without thinking about the weight of it. Told her maybe she ought to hang back near the fence, watch the horses instead of running the obstacle course Otis had laid, through the south pasture. Hazel didn't argue. She just ran it. Full out. Beat every single man on that course except Silent Crow, who didn't lose to anybody, and came in a full 3 strides ahead of Whit himself, who spent the rest of the morning red in the face, and considerably quieter about, who ought to hang back near the fence. Big doesn't mean slow, Hazel said, walking past him afterward, barely winded. It means the ground shakes a little harder when I catch up to you. Otis laughed at that. Real laughter, rare for him. And after that morning, nobody on that ranch ever again mistook Hazel Merrick's size for anything, but exactly what it was. Strength that most men spent their whole lives wishing they had, wrapped around a will, that had already survived worse than any of them could imagine. Agnes watched it all happen, from the kitchen window one morning, arms folded, jaw tight. "You're building an army," she said, when Emmett came in for coffee. "I'm building a reckoning." She poured, black and strong, and didn't smile, but something in her face softened at the edges. "If people find out you're harboring folks like this, funding an attack on what most everybody thinks is a legitimate cattle operation, it could ruin you. Everything you built. Let them think what they want to think." Emmett wrapped both hands around the cup like it might warm something deeper than his fingers. "I'm done playing by rules written by cowards and criminals." Agnes studied him a long moment. "Josephine would be proud," she said finally. Emmett didn't answer that. Couldn't, not without his voice breaking somewhere in the middle. He just drank his coffee, and watched, through the window, as his unlikely little army ran drills in the south pasture, and thought about promises made in the dark, and blood that was still owed. It was Hazel who saw it first. 6 days after, that morning on the obstacle course, she was walking the fence line alone, testing her own strength against the distance the way she'd started doing every afternoon, and she used the walk to watch. Really watch. It was a habit she'd built in, that basement without meaning to, noticing things, cataloging faces and gear, and small details, because details had been the only thing left to hold onto down there in the dark. 2 riders passed along the road bordering Stonebrick's eastern fence, slow, unhurried, the kind of pace that looked casual and wasn't. Hazel stopped walking. Watched. The lead rider's horse carried tack she recognized. Not the horse itself, she was almost sure of that, but the saddle. A particular stitching pattern along the skirt, a brand burned into the leather flap just below the horn. She'd seen that exact stitching before. Not out here on the road. Inside Stonebrick's own tack barn, days ago, when Otis had been fitting a new saddle to one of the ranch's spare horses. Her stomach dropped. Because that wasn't a coincidence. Saddles like that weren't bought off a shelf in Gallows Creek. They were made to order, one leatherworker, one specific hand, and Stonebrick's whole remuda had been fitted by the same man for years. Which meant that rider's saddle had come from Stonebrick. Which meant somebody riding for the Wolf's Ring, watching this ranch, this exact fence line, at this exact hour, was riding gear that belonged, one way or another, to Emmett's own operation. Hazel didn't move. Didn't breathe different than before, didn't let her face do anything, that would carry across 200 yards of open pasture. She'd learned that much in the basement too. The value of stillness. Of looking like prey that hadn't noticed the wolf yet. The riders passed on. Unhurried. Like men who had all the time in the world, because somebody inside these fences was keeping them informed of exactly how much time that was. Hazel turned and walked back toward the house, as fast as her body allowed, and every step felt like it took a year off her life. She found Emmett in the barn, checking a mare's shoe, and the words came out of her, before she'd even decided how to say them gently. "Somebody here's talking to them." Emmett straightened slow. "What?" "Two riders on the east road. Watching the place. One of them's got a stone brick saddle." Hazel's voice shook, not from fear this time, from something colder. "That gear doesn't wander off a ranch on its own, Emmett. Somebody handed it to them. Or sold it. Or worse." Emmett set down the mare's hoof like it had suddenly gone red-hot. "You're sure?" "I know that stitching. I watched Otis work it myself." Hazel's jaw tightened. "Somebody inside your fences is telling the Wolf's Ring exactly what's happening on this land. Which means every plan we've made in that study, every name, every route, every single thing we've said out loud in front of your own men." She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Emmett stood very still in the dim light of the barn, and for the first time, since Hazel had known him, which wasn't long, but felt already like something longer, she watched real fear cross his face. Not fear for himself. Fear for what trust had already cost him once, and what it might be costing him again, right now, from somewhere inside walls he'd built, with his own two hands, and thought he could still call safe. "Somebody I know," he said quietly. "Somebody I trust." "Somebody," Hazel said, "we're going to find." Outside, the sun was sliding down toward the western ridge, and the shadows in the yard stretched long, and thin across ground, that no longer felt as solid as it had that morning. Whatever piece Stonebrick had offered these past weeks was already gone, burned away as fast as it had come. Because the war they'd promised each other hadn't started out there in the hills, at some fortified ranch full of strangers. It had already started here. Inside the fence line. Under Emmett's own roof. And neither of them, standing in that darkening barn, with the weight of that discovery settling cold between them, had the first idea, yet just how far the rot went, or how many more faces they trusted would turn out to be wearing masks. Trust is a strange thing to lose. It doesn't happen all at once. It leaks out of a man slow, the way water finds a crack in a dam, and just keeps finding it, wider every day, until one morning he wakes up, and the whole structure's sitting in a puddle at his feet. Emmett Wilder had trusted Stonebrick's hands like family. Some of them longer than family, if he was honest. Men who'd built fence line beside him in weather that should have killed them both. Men he'd handed his back to, more than once, without a second thought. Now he watched every single one of them differently. Because that was what a traitor did to a place. Didn't just betray you once. Betrayed you every single day after, retroactively, poisoning years you used to think were solid ground. He hated that. Hated it the way he hated weak ice. "You can't watch all of them," Hazel said, 3 mornings after the saddle. She'd taken to standing beside him on the porch at dawn now, her ribs healed enough by then, that standing didn't cost her much anymore. "You'll drive yourself into the ground trying. Somebody handed our plans to the ring. I know. Somebody sat in that study with us. Drank my coffee. Heard every name we said out loud." Emmett's jaw worked, tight, like he was chewing on something that wouldn't go down easy. "And I don't know which face it's wearing. Which is exactly why we don't chase it head-on." Hazel's voice stayed level. Steady in a way that had started to anchor him, these past weeks, more than he wanted to admit out loud. "You go charging at every hand on this ranch demanding answers, whoever it is just goes quiet, Buries deeper. We'll never find them. So what do? We watch. A pause. Quiet. Patient. Same as I learned to do in that basement. You don't survive people like that by being loud, Emmett. You survive them by being smarter. He looked at her a long moment. Something in his chest loosened, just slightly, at the certainty in her voice. All right, he said. Quiet, then. Except quiet wasn't easy. Not when the whole ranch felt like it was holding its breath. The newcomers didn't make quiet any simpler either. Not because they were loud, exactly, but because 6 strangers training, with rifles in the south pasture had a way of turning a working ranch into something else entirely. A camp. A staging ground. And staging grounds had their own noise, their own rhythm, and none of it blended easy with the ordinary business of cattle. Otis Crane ran the weapons training most mornings. One eye gone, lost it the same year his daughter disappeared, though he never said which came first, and nobody asked, but the eye he had left saw straighter than most men's pair. He drilled the others on loading, on distance, on the particular discipline of not firing, until you had a clean shot, because a wasted round in a real fight was sometimes the difference between walking home and not. Again, he'd say, flat, unimpressed, watching Whit fumble a reload for the 3rd time. Your hands are shaking. My hands are fine. Your hands are shaking, because you're thinking about your farm instead of your rifle. Otis didn't raise his voice. Never did. Thinking gets you killed. Thought I told you that already. You told me a lot of things. Tell you again, then. Free of charge. Whit reloaded. Steadier this time. Otis grunted, as close to praise as the man ever offered, and moved down the line. Nell Sawyer worked apart from the others, mostly, down near the old equipment shed she'd claimed for herself the 2nd week she arrived. She mixed powders, with the careful, unhurried patience of a woman who'd already lost fingers to carelessness once, and had no intention of losing more. You ever going to tell anybody what you're building down there? Rosa asked her one afternoon, leaning in the shed doorway, arms crossed. When it's ready. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. Nell didn't look up from her work. Wire's temperamental. Talking while I work makes my hands unsteady. Unsteady hands around blasting powder tend to end conversations permanently. Rosa left her to it. Rosa herself trained differently than the others, quieter, more contained, the quiet of somebody who'd learned young, that drawing attention got you hurt. She'd been sold into the rings operation at 15. Escaped at 19. For years was a long time to learn what silence bought you. She and Hazel found each other early, the way survivors sometimes do, without either one saying much about why. You don't flinch, Hazel said to her once, watching Rosa work a blade drill against a fence post, fast, precise, no wasted motion. Neither do you. I flinch plenty. Just don't let it show. Rosa's mouth curved, small, the first thing close to a smile Hazel had seen on her. Same thing, where I come from. Silent Crow trained alone, mostly, out past the tree line, where the others rarely wandered. He didn't explain himself, didn't offer his reasons for wanting the ring gone, and nobody pushed. Some grief didn't need an audience to be real. But his rifle work, when Emmett watched it, from a distance, was the cleanest shooting he'd ever seen, from any man, soldier or otherwise, and that told its own story well enough. And then there was Jonah. Jonah Pruitt showed up during the 2nd week, 17 going on 18, all elbows and nerves, and a hunger to prove something, that made Emmett's chest hurt just looking at him. His older sister had been taken 3 years back. Never found. Never heard from again. He'd been trying to join every posse and bounty crew in the territory since he turned 15, and every single one had turned him away for being too young. Emmett almost turned him away too. Almost. Except the boy had looked at him, with an expression Emmett recognized, from a mirror, some mornings, and the word almost hadn't survived the weight of that look. "You know what you're walking into," Emmett told him, the day he let him stay. "Yes, sir." "No. You don't." "Nobody does, first time." Emmett studied him a long moment. "You listen to Otis. You listen to Silent Crow. You do exactly what you're told, exactly when you're told it. First time you freeze up out there, people die. Might be you. Might be somebody standing next to you. I understand. You think you do." Emmett's voice softened, just slightly. "Hope you never have to find out different. Jonah trained harder than anybody. Up before dawn, running drills long, after Otis called the others in for supper, like he was trying to close some gap between himself and men twice his age, through sheer stubbornness alone. Hazel took a liking to him almost immediately, the particular kind of soft-handed patience she'd never gotten the chance to show her own brother once he'd grown past needing it. She showed him how to hold a knife, so it wouldn't turn in his grip. Showed him how to read a man's shoulders, before his hands moved. "He reminds you of your brother," Emmett said, once, sitting beside her on the porch. "Every damn day." Neither of them said anything else about it. Didn't need to. Amos Tilden had worked Stonebrick's freight logistics for 6 years. Longer than most of the current hands. He kept the wagon schedules, coordinated shipments, handled the paperwork Emmett trusted him with because Amos had never once given him reason not to. Hazel noticed him watching the training, that first week, standing off by the fence, with a look on his face that didn't quite match the pride most of the older hands wore when they saw the newcomers finding their feet. It looked more like a man watching a fire he'd already decided he couldn't put out. She thought nothing of it at the time. Figured it was just an old man uneasy about guns on his employer's land. Filed it away, without a second glance, the way a person files away 100 small things every day, that only mean something later. The break came, finally, 10 days after the saddle. Emmett rode into Gallows Creek alone, against Agnes's loud objections, and Hazel's quieter, more dangerous kind of disagreement, the kind that came, with a long silence instead of an argument, which somehow felt worse. "You go into that town alone," Hazel had said, "and Cross finds a reason to put a bullet in you, there's nobody there to stop it. I have business associates there. Legitimate ones. People who owe me favors, and don't ask inconvenient questions. That's not the same as safe. Nothing about any of this is safe." Emmett had checked his revolver, methodical, avoiding her eyes. "If the ring's moving prisoners soon, there'll be talk. Freight paperwork somebody's filing. Wagon somebody's loading. I need to know what that paperwork says, and I know exactly where to find it." Hazel hadn't argued further. Just watched him ride out, with a look that said this conversation isn't finished, and Emmett understood, riding down toward town, that it wasn't. Gallows Creek sprawled along both sides of a rutted main street, buildings held up more by habit than sound construction. Boomed once, a dozen years back, when silver ran thick in the hills. Now it survived on stubbornness, and cheap whiskey, same as most towns, that had outlived their reason for existing. The land office sat squeezed between a barbershop and a boarding house that had seen better decades. Inside, a clerk named Cyrus Lund sat behind a desk buried under ledgers, squinting through spectacles too weak for the job they were meant to do. He looked up when the door opened. Recognition dawned. Nervousness followed close behind, the way it always did, with men who owed Emmett something they hadn't yet found a way to repay. "Mr. Wilder." Lund stood, so fast a stack of papers slid off the desk. "I wasn't, that is, I didn't know you were coming to town." "Relax, Cyrus." Emmett closed the door behind him. "I'm not here to collect." Lund's shoulders sagged, visibly, like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying for weeks. "Of course. What can I help with? Freight manifests. Anything moving through Coldwater Junction the next week or two. I want to know who's shipping, what they're carrying, where it's headed. Color drained from Lund's face. Mr. Wilder, those records are supposed to stay confidential. Cyrus. Emmett's voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. I'm not asking for state secrets. I'm asking about shipping, through a junction, that runs on my contracts, my land, my name. You can help me find what I need, or I can ride to the territorial capital, and file a formal inquiry, and that'll mean weeks of very public questions about how business gets conducted around here. A pause. Or, Emmett said, softer, you spend 10 minutes pulling files, and we both walk away from this conversation happy. Lund swallowed. Disappeared into the back room without another word. Emmett stood at the window while he waited. Watched the ordinary business of a town that had no idea what moved beneath its own floorboards. 2 cowhands staggered out of the saloon across the street, midday drunk already. A woman swept a boardwalk that probably hadn't needed sweeping in a decade. Ordinary people, going about ordinary mornings, while somewhere not far from here children got loaded into wagons like livestock. Lund returned carrying a folder stuffed thick with paper. Everything filed for the junction, next 10 days. His hands weren't steady. If anybody finds out I showed you this. Nobody will. Emmett flipped through it at the counter. Most of it was exactly what it claimed to be. Timber. Mining equipment. Feed. Ordinary freight moving through an ordinary junction. Then, buried in the middle, he found it. A manifest, dated 4 days out. Filed under a company name, Silverline Livestock, that Emmett had never once heard of in 11 years of running freight through this territory. And Emmett knew every legitimate outfit working this stretch of country. Every single one. Which meant Silverline didn't exist. Which meant it was a shell. Paper cover for cargo that had no business being called cattle. Who filed this? Emmett said, tapping the page. Lund leaned in, squinting. That'd be Harold Finch. Freight agent. Works mostly for, he stopped himself. For who, Cyrus? Lund's voice dropped to something barely above breath. The Cade operation. Up in the hills. Emmett's jaw went tight enough to ache. How many wagons? Manifest says 4. Heavy load, based on the weight. 4 wagons. Enough to carry 20, 30 people packed tight. Hazel had said the ring moved prisoners every 2 weeks. This had to be it, the next transport, already scheduled, already moving forward, while Emmett had been playing careful and quiet back at Stonebrick. Thank you, Cyrus. Emmett closed the folder. Handed it back. You've been a help. Please. Lund's hands were shaking outright now. Be careful. The Cade brothers, they're not men you cross lightly. I've seen what happens to folks who try. So have I, Emmett said, and stepped back out, into the street. He didn't get 10 feet, before he walked almost directly, into Sheriff Wyatt Cross. Cross was a big man running soft in his middle years, mustache waxed into something almost dignified, badge catching the noon light like it meant anything at all. 2 guns on his hips, both well cared for. Eyes flat and empty in the way of men who'd stopped caring, which side of right and wrong they stood on, a long time back, and never missed it. Emmett Wilder. Cross's voice carried false warmth like a coat 2 sizes too big. Long way from Stonebrick. What brings you to our little town? Business. Emmett kept his voice even. Reviewing freight paperwork. Freight paperwork. Cross's smile didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Funny thing. Heard your contract's been having some trouble lately. Missing shipments. Damaged goods. Real shame, that. I manage. Cross stepped closer. Close enough Emmett could smell whiskey writing under his words. You're a smart man, Wilder. Successful. Be an awful shame if something disrupted all that. Accidents happen out here. Even to rich men. That a threat, Sheriff? That's advice. Cross's smile widened, ugly at the edges. From somebody who understands how things work in this territory. You stick to your cattle, your money, your business. Leave the law enforcing to me. Everybody stays happy that way. Emmett held his stare. Didn't blink first. I'll keep that in mind, he said, and pushed past him toward his horse. Every muscle in his body stayed locked tight the whole walk, fighting the very real, very simple urge to turn around, and put a bullet through the man's skull right there on the boardwalk. That satisfaction would have to wait. Because right now, he had information. And information, in this particular war, was worth more than any single bullet he could spend on Wyatt Cross today. He rode home fast, the folder's contents burning in his memory the whole way. 4 wagons. Silverline livestock. 4 days. The war had a clock on it now. That night, the whole crew gathered in the bunkhouse, Emmett, Hazel, Otis, Nell, Whit, Rosa, Silent Crow, Jonah, and Emmett spread what he knew across the table like a man laying out a hand of cards he wasn't sure he liked. 4 wagons, he said. Filed under a company that doesn't exist. Leaving Coldwater Junction in 4 days, headed east. Nell leaned over the rough map. Junction's wide open. Flat grassland for miles in every direction. Hit them there, we've got no cover at all. We don't hit them at the junction, Hazel said. She traced a line down toward a narrow blue thread on the map, a river cutting through low ground, before it widened into open country. We hit them here. At Miller's Ford. Only crossing on, that whole stretch shallow enough for loaded wagons. Everything east of the junction funnels through it. Otis studied the spot. Open ground on both banks, though. No high walls to trap them in. No, Hazel agreed. But there's water. And Nell's got a talent for water, doesn't she? Every eye in the room turned toward Nell Sawyer. She grinned, slow, and it wasn't a comforting thing to watch. You want me to dam it? I want you to dam it, Hazel said, and then blow it wide open right when those wagons are mid-crossing. Flash flood hits, wagons get stuck, mules panic, and suddenly 9 or 10 armed men have got their hands a lot fuller than they planned on. That's a hell of a thing to time right, Whit said. Everything about this is a hell of a thing to time right, Hazel shot back. You got a better idea, I'm all ears. Silence. Nobody offered one. How long's it take to build a dam that'll actually hold back enough water to matter, Emmett asked. 3 days, working hard, Nell said. Upstream bend, there's a natural choke point already half doing the job for us. I just need timber, and hands, and nobody riding along that stretch of river to notice what we're building, before it's ready. You'll have both, Emmett said. And the wagons themselves? Rosa asked. Once they're stuck, once the water's got them? We're waiting on the banks, Otis said. Both sides. Once the flood hits, once they're scrambling, we come down fast. Take the guards before they organize. What about whoever's inside the wagons? Jonah's voice cracked slightly on the question, young and earnest in a way that made something ache in Emmett's chest. That's the whole point of moving fast, Hazel said, gentler than she'd spoken to anybody else at that table. Water rises, we hit hard, we get those wagons open, before anybody drowns, and before anybody gets shot in the crossfire. No hesitation. No delay. Emmett looked around the table. 6 faces, all of them carrying some version of the same grief that had brought him to this exact moment. Everybody clear, he said. Nods. Grim, steady nods. Then we build a dam, Emmett said, and in 4 days, we end a piece of this. They worked through the following 2 days, with the particular focus of people, who understood, deep in their bones, that failure here meant something worse than losing. Nell directed the timber work herself, measuring, testing, cursing under her breath at every log that didn't sit exactly right against the choke point in the river. Otis and Whit hauled wood, until their hands blistered. Silent Crow scouted the eastern approach to Miller's Ford, memorizing every rise and hollow where a man could hide, with a rifle. Hazel spent those 2 days doing something else entirely. She rode out, against everybody's better judgment, though nobody quite had the nerve to stop her, toward the edges of Stonebrick's own land, watching. Waiting. Because if somebody inside these fences was still passing information out, she wanted to catch them doing it. Wanted proof, not just suspicion, before she brought it to Emmett. On the second afternoon, she found it. She watched Amos Tilden, from a rise a quarter-mile off, tucked behind a stand of scrub pine, meet a rider on the eastern boundary, the same stretch of road, where she'd first spotted the Stonebrick saddle. Watched him hand something across. A folded paper. Watched the rider tuck it away, and ride off north, toward the hills. And she watched something else, too, that she almost missed. The way Amos stood there a long moment, after the rider left, shoulders bowed, one hand pressed flat against his own chest like he was trying to hold something in, that had already started coming loose. A man doing something he hated. That was a different thing entirely, from a man, who enjoyed it, and even from a distance, even furious, Hazel found herself noticing the difference. She didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead she rode straight back to the main house, and found Emmett in his study, and the look on her face must have said everything, before her mouth caught up, because he was on his feet, before she finished crossing the threshold. "Amos Tilden," she said. Emmett's face went, through something complicated, disbelief first, sharp and immediate, then something heavier settling in behind it. "Amos. I watched him hand a paper to a rider not an hour ago. Same road. Same kind of meeting. Amos has worked this ranch 6 years. Emmett's voice came out strained, like a rope pulled past what it was built to hold. He was here before half the current hands. I trusted him with the books, Hazel. With everything. I know. Why would he? I don't know why yet, Hazel said. But I know what I saw. And there was something else. He didn't look like a man enjoying his work. He looked sick over it. Doesn't matter how he looked. Maybe not, Hazel said. But it's worth remembering. They brought Amos in, that evening, quiet, no fuss, told him Emmett needed him for freight questions in the study, the kind of ordinary request, that had happened 100 times, over 6 years, and never once meant anything more than exactly what it said. This time it did. Amos Tilden was a thin man, sun-worn, somewhere past 50, with the stoop of a man who'd spent decades bent, over ledgers and loading docks. He sat across the desk, from Emmett with his hat in his lap, and something in his eyes told Hazel, standing quiet by the window, arms crossed, that he already knew exactly why he'd been called in. "Amos," Emmett said. "Quiet. I need you to tell me about the paper you handed off on the Eastern Road today." The color went out of Amos's face like somebody had pulled a plug. "Mr. Wilder, I don't." Emmett's voice cracked like a whip, once, sharp enough that Amos flinched back in his chair. 6 years. I trusted you 6 years. Don't you dare sit there, and lie to me on top of it. Silence stretched long and ugly. Then Amos's shoulders caved in, all at once, like something inside him had finally given up holding its shape. "They own me," he said, voice cracking. 2 years back. I owed money, bad money, gambling debt I couldn't cover, and a man came around collecting for the Cades. Told me they'd forgive it. All of it. If I just kept them informed. Schedules. Freight routes. Nothing that mattered, they said. Nothing that would hurt anybody. Nothing that mattered, Emmett repeated, flat, disbelieving. I didn't know what they were using it for. Not at first. Amos's voice broke entirely now, tears running unashamed down a face gone gray with shame. By the time I understood, by the time I knew what kind of operation I was feeding information to, I was already in too deep. They told me what would happen to my family, if I stopped. So you kept going. I kept going, Amos whispered. Emmett stood. Walked to the window, the same way he had, that first night, with Hazel, staring out at land he'd built, with his own hands, and now couldn't fully trust. How far back does it go, he said, not turning around. The information you gave them. How far back? 2 years. Little things, mostly. Shipment dates. Route changes. 2 years. Emmett's voice had gone dangerously quiet. 3 years ago, my wife found a trafficking route running, through freight contracts filed under my name. She took that evidence to Sheriff Cross. 3 days later she was dead, and everybody called it a riding accident. He turned, slow, and the look on his face made even Hazel go still. Did you know her? Did you ever pass along anything about what she was working on? Amos's face crumpled entirely. I didn't know, he said, barely audible. I swear to you, Mr. Wilder, I never knew what I was. I told them once, maybe 18 months back, that Mrs. Wilder had been asking freight agents strange questions. About routes. About manifests that didn't match their cargo. I thought it was nothing. I thought. He couldn't finish. The room went absolutely silent. Hazel watched something break behind Emmett's eyes, not loud, not violent, just a quiet, total collapse of whatever hope he'd been quietly nursing, that Josephine's death had been separate, from all of this, an isolated tragedy instead of one more casualty of a rot, that had been living inside his own operation the whole time. You told them she was asking questions, Emmett said, each word landing like a stone dropped, from a great height. You told the men, who killed her, that she was getting close. I didn't know that's what they'd. You didn't ask. Emmett's voice cracked open, raw, furious and grieving in the same breath. 6 years I trusted you, and you never once asked what happened to the information you were handing off. Never once wondered what it cost. Amos said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Emmett stood there a long moment, breathing hard, hands opening and closing at his sides like they didn't know, yet whether they wanted to hit something, or simply hold still. Get him to the root cellar, he said finally, voice gone hoarse. Lock him in. We'll decide what happens to him once this is finished. I can't, he stopped. Started again. I can't think about that right now. Otis and Whit led Amos out. The old man didn't fight it. Didn't say another word. But at the door, he stopped, and looked back once, and said, so quiet only Hazel caught it, I've been trying to find a way to fix some of it. I swear I have. Nobody answered him. The door closed on whatever he meant by that, and it stayed closed, unremembered by anyone, but Hazel, for a while yet. Hazel crossed the room, and stood beside Emmett at the window, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. That's not your fault, she said quietly. He worked for me 6 years. And a debt collector threatened his family, and he made a coward's choice, and that choice cost you everything. Hazel's voice stayed steady, deliberate. That's on him. Not on you. You didn't hand your wife's name to Ezra Cade. He did. Emmett didn't answer for a long moment. I keep thinking, he said finally, about all the conversations we had in this room. Mine and Josephine's. Wondering how many of them ended up in Ezra Cade's hands, before they ever finished leaving my own house. Then let's make sure this next conversation, Hazel said, is the last one that ever gets out. They doubled every precaution after that. Moved planning sessions to the bunkhouse instead of the main house. Kept the crew small for anything sensitive. Watched the roads themselves now, in shifts, so nothing else slipped past them the way Amos had for 6 long years. And 2 days later, with the dam nearly finished, and Miller's Ford ready to swallow 4 wagons whole, everything they'd planned came apart faster than any of them had braced for. It started with Silent Crow riding in hard, just past dawn, horse lathered white with sweat. "Wagons are moving," he said, swinging down before his horse had fully stopped. "Now. Today. Not 4 days from now." Emmett's stomach dropped straight through the floor. "That's not possible." The manifest said. "Manifest's wrong, or they moved the schedule up." Silent Crow's face stayed grim. "I watched 4 wagons roll out of Coldwater Junction myself, not 2 hours back. They're moving fast. They'll hit Miller's Ford by midday." "The dam's not finished," Nell said, already moving toward her gear. "Not fully. I've got maybe 60% of the water pressure I wanted." "Will it hold enough to stop 4 wagons?" Emmett said. Nell's jaw tightened. "It'll have to." They rode hard. Every one of them, Emmett, Hazel, Otis, Nell, Whit, Rosa, Silent Crow, and Jonah, 17 years old, and pale-faced with something between terror and determination, pushed their horses across rough ground toward Miller's Ford, with a clock running down inside every single chest. Because somebody had moved that schedule up. Which meant somebody, somewhere, had gotten spooked. Which meant Amos Tilden's absence had already been noticed. Which meant the Cades knew, or suspected, that something had gone wrong inside their own network, and had reacted the only way men like that ever reacted to fear. By moving faster. By closing the gap, before their enemies could close it first. They reached the ford, with barely enough daylight to get into position. Nell scrambled up the choke point, checking her charges, with hands that, for the first time, since Hazel had met her, weren't entirely steady. 60%, Nell muttered, mostly to herself. 60% has to be enough. The others spread along both banks, low behind scrub and rock, rifles ready, waiting for the sound of wagon wheels against gravel. It came faster than any of them wanted. 4 wagons. Canvas covered, pulled by mules straining against the weight, flanked by riders, more riders than the manifest had suggested. Hazel counted from her position behind a boulder, jaw tight. 9 visible. Maybe more hidden among the wagons themselves. "More guards than we planned for," Otis breathed, from somewhere off to her left. "We knew that was a risk," Emmett said, low. The lead wagon reached the water. Started across. Wheels cutting through the shallow current, mules picking their way careful, over the rocky bed. "Nell," Emmett said, quiet, urgent. "Now or never." Nell's hand hovered over the charge. Waited. Waited until the second wagon hit water. The third. Then she brought her hand down. The explosion tore, through the dam upstream, with a violence that shook the ground under every one of them. Water surged forward, not the wall Nell had planned for, 60% instead of the full force she'd wanted, but still enough. Still a wave that hit those wagons broadside, and sent mules screaming, panicking, rearing against their traces. "Now!" Otis roared, and the world exploded into gunfire. Hazel came up, from behind her boulder, sighted on a rider fighting to control his spooked horse, fired. He dropped. She worked the bolt, found another target, fired again. Around her, the others did the same. Whit. Rosa. Silent Crow, methodical and deadly, from the far bank. It should have been, over fast, should have been the clean, brutal execution they'd planned for. Except one of the wagon covers tore loose in the chaos, canvas ripping free in the wind, and the water, and what spilled out wasn't people. It was crates. Rifle crates, dozens of them, tumbling half into the rushing water, wood splitting open to reveal gun barrels catching the midday light. "That's not prisoners," Hazel shouted, horror climbing up her throat. "That's weapons, they're not just moving people, they're arming up." Because that changed everything. Because if the ring was shipping this many rifles, through a route they thought nobody knew about, then whatever Emmett and Hazel had been planning to fight, some ranch full of guards, some criminal operation running on fear and bribery, was smaller, far smaller, than whatever the ring actually intended to become. And that thought had barely finished forming in Hazel's mind, when she heard Jonah scream. She turned. Too slow. Always too slow, in moments like that, no matter how fast a person actually moved. Jonah had broken from cover, young, eager, trying to reach a wagon, before the current swept it further downstream, trying to prove himself the way 17-year-olds always tried to prove themselves, at exactly the wrong moment. A guard, half submerged, rifle somehow still dry, put a bullet straight through the boy's chest. Jonah went down in the water, without a sound. No. Hazel was moving, before she'd decided to move, splashing into the current, Emmett right behind her, both of them ignoring the gunfire still cracking around them, because none of that mattered anymore, not with Jonah's body already starting to drift. They reached him together. Pulled him up, onto the bank, water streaming off both of them, off him, off a wound, that was already telling them everything they needed to know, before either of them said a word out loud. Jonah. Hazel's hands pressed hard against his chest, useless, desperate. Jonah, stay with me. His eyes found hers. Wide. Frightened. 17 years old, and already understanding, in some deep animal way, that this was the end of something instead of the beginning of anything else. Did we? His voice came out barely a whisper, blood at the corner of his mouth. Did we stop them? Hazel's throat closed up entirely. You did good, she managed. You did so good, Jonah. His hand found hers. Gripped it, weak, for just a moment. Then it didn't grip anything at all. The gunfire around them tapered off, slow, as the last of the ring's guards either fell, or fled into the scattered trees beyond the ford. Silence settled over Miller's Ford like something physical, something with weight, broken only by the sound of water still rushing past crates of spilled rifles, and the ragged breathing of people who just watched a boy die in front of them. Emmett knelt beside Hazel, beside Jonah's body, and said nothing at all for a long, long time. Because there was nothing to say. Otis was the first to move again, finally, wading into the water to check the last wagon, the only one that hadn't torn open, canvas still mostly intact despite the flood. He pulled it back. Inside sat 6 people. Huddled. Terrified. Not weapons this time, actual prisoners, exactly what they'd come for in the first place, alive despite everything the water and the gunfire had thrown at that crossing. They're alive, Otis called, voice raw. All 6 of them, alive. Small mercy. Almost too small to feel, standing there with Jonah's body still warm on the riverbank. Hazel looked down at the boy's face, young even in death, and felt something crack open inside her chest, that she didn't have words for yet. We got 6 people out, Emmett said quietly, kneeling beside her. And we found out something about this fight, that would have killed us all later, if we hadn't learned it today. Doesn't make this easier. No, Emmett agreed. It doesn't. They wrapped Jonah's body themselves. Careful. Respectful. The way you wrap something, that deserved better than what it got. Nell stood at the ruined dam, staring at the water still rushing past the wreckage of her work, her face unreadable. 60%, she said, to nobody in particular. If I'd had 3 more days. You didn't have 3 more days, Otis said, gruff, not unkind. None of us did. That's not on you. Nell didn't answer. Just kept staring at the water, the way people stare at things they can't, yet let themselves feel. They rode back to Stonebrick slower than they'd ridden out, 6 freed prisoners crowded, onto spare horses, Jonah's body wrapped, and carried across Otis's saddle, and nobody spoke much along the way. Because what was there left to say? Hazel rode beside Emmett in silence for the first hour, the weight of the day pressing down on both of them like something, with actual physical mass. "He was 17, she said finally. "I know. I told him he did good." Right before she stopped. Started again. "I don't even know if that was true. He broke cover. Got himself killed trying to prove something none of us needed him to prove." "He got killed," Emmett said quietly, "trying to save people he'd never even met." "That's not nothing, Hazel. Whatever else it wasn't nothing." Hazel didn't answer that. Just rode on, the brand on her shoulder aching under her shirt the way it always did, when her whole body remembered, all at once, exactly what this fight was costing everybody who touched it. Because that was the truth nobody had said out loud back at that first meeting in the study, weeks ago, when the whole thing had still felt like something they could control, through careful planning and righteous fury. War didn't work that way. War took whoever it wanted, whenever it wanted them, and all the planning, and dynamite and damned rivers in the world couldn't guarantee it would only take the people who deserved to be taken. They buried Jonah Pruitt on a low rise overlooking Stonebrick's north pasture 2 days later, the whole crew gathered in a silence heavier than any words could have filled. Agnes had washed him herself, dressed him proper, and stood now beside the fresh grave, with her jaw set hard against tears she refused, on principle, to let fall in front of anybody. Emmett said a few words. Simple ones. About courage, and cost, and the particular grief of losing somebody too young to have earned any of what had happened to him. Hazel said nothing at all. Just stood there, with her hand resting on the raw earth long, after the others had drifted back toward the house, thinking about her own brother, about the unfairness of a world that kept demanding this exact same price, from people who'd never asked to owe it. 6 freed prisoners watched, from a respectful distance, understanding, in the way survivors understand each other, exactly what this moment cost the people who'd risked everything to bring them home. And somewhere north, up in those pine-thick hills, Ezra Cade was almost certainly already recalculating. Already understanding that whatever quiet certainty had let him move prisoners and rifles through this territory for 8 years unbothered had just been shattered at a river crossing by people he hadn't even known existed a month ago. That made him dangerous in a whole new way. Because a wounded animal, Emmett knew, from 11 years of trapping and hunting in high country, was never more lethal than in the moment right after it first understood it could actually be killed. The ring knew now. And whatever came next, Emmett understood, standing over a boy's grave, with Hazel silent, and grieving beside him, was going to come faster, and harder, and with far less mercy than anything they'd faced so far. The war had found its true shape at last. And there was no way left to walk back from it now. Grief has a smell to it. Not the obvious kind, not blood, not smoke, not the sour copper stink of a man dying wrong. The other kind. The kind that lives in wet wool, and cold coffee, and a room nobody's opened the windows in for 2 days straight. Stonebrick smelled like that now. Emmett stood in the doorway of the bunkhouse the morning after Jonah's burial, and made himself breathe it in anyway. Because that was the price of building something out of other people's pain. He didn't get to look away from what it cost. Not even when looking away would have been so much easier. 6 freed prisoners sat wrapped in blankets near the stove, still not fully believing, most of them, that the wagons had stopped. That the water had come. That somebody had actually broken them out instead of just moving them one basement to the next. Agnes moved among them, with broth and bandages, and a silence that said more than any comfort she could have offered in words. And in the root cellar, under all of it, Amos Tilden sat in the dark, with 2 years of guilt, and a debt he couldn't outrun no matter how many prayers he tried on it. Hazel found Emmett in the doorway. Didn't say anything at first. Just stood beside him, close enough their shoulders nearly touched, the way they'd started standing together, without either one commenting on when that had begun. "You slept?" she asked. "No. Me either." Silence. Comfortable in the way only two people carrying the same weight could manage. "They knew we were coming," Emmett said finally. "Move the schedule up." Which means Amos wasn't feeding them everything. Which means there's still a gap between what they know and what we know. Small comfort. It's the only comfort we've got. Hazel turned to face him. Her jaw was set in the particular way it got right, before she said something he wasn't going to like. "We can't wait," she said. "Every day we sit here mourning is a day Ezra Cade uses to fortify that ranch. He knows we exist now. Knows we're organized. That means guards double. That means whatever chance we had at surprise gets smaller every single sunrise we spend standing in doorways. Jonah's barely in the ground. I know." Her voice cracked, just slightly, the first real crack Emmett had heard in it, since the day he'd pulled her out of that storeroom. "I know exactly how fresh that grave is, Emmett. I helped dig it." A breath. "But if we wait until it stops hurting to move again, we'll wait forever. Grief doesn't come with a schedule. War does." Emmett looked at her a long moment. Because she was right. Because that was the thing about Hazel Merrick that had unsettled him from the very first conversation in that guest room. She never softened a hard truth just to make a room more comfortable to stand in. And Josephine had been exactly the same way, once, and maybe that similarity should have scared him more than it did. 3 days, he said. "We move in 3 days. 2. 3. His voice went flat, final. "Nell needs time to rebuild what she can carry. Otis needs to drill wit, and Rosa on close work, because whatever we find in that ranch isn't going to be open ground like the ford. It's going to be halls. Rooms. Close range." A pause. 3 days, Hazel. "Not because I don't feel the clock same as you. Because rushing got Jonah killed once already." Hazel's jaw tightened. But she nodded. 3 days, she agreed. 3 days felt like 3 years. They spent them the way people spend the hours, before something they can't take back, sharpening things that were already sharp, checking things that were already checked, filling the silence with work because work was the only thing that kept the fear from getting too loud. Otis drilled wit, and Rosa on room clearing in the empty barn, over and over, until the motion stopped needing thought at all. Nell rebuilt her charges, from what remained of her stores, muttering the whole time about margins, and things that could still go wrong. Silent Crow disappeared for the better part of a day, and came back, with a hand-drawn map of the terrain surrounding the Cade Ranch more detailed than anything Hazel remembered, from her own captivity. Hazel spent those 3 days doing something harder than any of it. She went down to the root cellar. Amos looked up, when the door opened, flinching at the light, a man who'd clearly spent 3 days expecting the worst, and half hoping for it, just to end the waiting. "Miss Merrick. I'm not here to hurt you. Wouldn't blame you if you were." Hazel sat down on an overturned crate across from him. Studied his face a long moment, the deep lines, the gray stubble, the exhaustion of a man who'd been carrying a secret, so long it had worn grooves into him. "You said something at the door," she said. "When Otis walked you out. Said you'd been trying to find a way to fix some of it. What did you mean by that?" Amos went very still. "You heard that. I hear a lot of things. Answer the question." He was quiet a long moment, hands twisting together in his lap. "About 8 months back," he said, slow, "after I started hearing whispers about what really happened to Mrs. Wilder, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't undo what I'd already given them. But I started keeping my own records. Copies of everything I handed over. Every schedule, every route. Told myself if the day ever came, it might be worth something turned the other direction. Hazel went very still. Where are these records? Hidden, Amos said. Somewhere they'll never think to look for them. I haven't decided, yet what to do with them. Been too scared. Is there a ledger? Hazel asked. Something bigger. Something Ezra Cade keeps himself. Amos nodded, slow. There's a ledger. Real records, not the fake manifests, the true ones. Payments. Names of every official on their payroll. I've never seen it myself, but I've heard the men who guard the ranch talk about it. Kept in the main lodge. Locked. Why haven't you told Emmett any of this before now? Because telling him meant admitting how much I actually knew, Amos said, and something in his voice broke entirely on the last word. Meant admitting I'd been carrying more than just schedules for 2 years. I was scared, Miss Merrick. Scared of them. Scared of what Mr. Wilder would do once he understood exactly how much I'd handed over. Hazel studied him a long moment. You're going to tell him everything, she said. Today. All of it. The ledger. Your own records. Where you've hidden them. Amos nodded, slow, defeated. Yes, ma'am. And Amos. She stood, moved toward the door, then stopped. If any part of what you tell us helps end this, helps us find that ledger, helps put names to every crooked badge and judge that's been protecting them, that matters. Won't undo what you did. But it matters. She left him sitting there in the half-dark, and for the first time, since he'd been locked away, something in his face looked less like a man waiting for punishment, and more like a man who'd finally set down a weight he'd been dragging for 2 years straight. The plan changed after that. Not the target. Not the timeline. But the shape of the thing. A ledger, Emmett said, that evening, standing over the map in the study, Josephine's photograph watching, from the wall the way it always did. Real names. Real payments. If that exists, if we can get our hands on it, that's not just revenge anymore. That's the whole network. Judges, marshals, everybody on their payroll. That's exactly what your wife was building toward, Hazel said quietly. Before she ran out of time. Emmett didn't answer that directly. Just nodded once, jaw tight, and turned back to the map. We can't go in, through the tunnel, Silent Crow said, tapping the sketch he'd made of the ranch's layout. They'll have doubled guards there, since Hazel's first escape. Sealed entrances, probably. New locks. Then how? Whit asked. Silent Crow's finger moved to a different point on the map, the main gate, where 2 roads met, before running up toward the lodge. Guard change, he said. I watched 3 nights running. Same pattern every time. Shift changes at midnight. 15, maybe 20 minutes, were the gates manned by fresh men still half asleep, old men still walking off toward the bunkhouse, and everybody's attention split between coming and going instead of watching the road. You want us to walk in during the handoff, Otis said. Bold. Bold's better than another tunnel nobody expects to survive twice, Hazel said. They spent the better part of an hour working the details. Rosa and Whit would come in first, dressed rough, faces dirty, claiming to be new hires sent up, from Gallows Creek, a lie thin enough to crack under real scrutiny, but thick enough to survive 15 confused minutes of guard change chaos. Once inside, they'd create a distraction near the bunkhouse. Fire, maybe, or something loud enough to pull attention toward the wrong end of the property. While that happened, Emmett and Hazel would move, through the gate itself, using the confusion to slip past toward the main lodge. Otis, Nell, and Silent Crow would hold position outside, ready to cover the retreat, ready to hit the perimeter hard the moment things went sideways, because things always went sideways, eventually, no matter how careful the planning. And if it doesn't work, Jonah's absence sat heavy in the room, unspoken but present in every single pause. If the guard change isn't what Silent Crow watched 3 nights running. Then we improvise, Hazel said. Same as always. Nobody laughed. Nobody needed to. They all understood, by now, exactly what improvising had already cost them once. The night they moved, the sky hung low, and starless, thick clouds rolling down off the mountains like something had spooked them too. Good weather for what they needed. Bad visibility worked both ways, but it worked more in favor of people trying not to be seen than people trying to watch a gate. They left the horses hidden in a ravine a half-mile out, and moved the rest of the way on foot, 7 of them now instead of 8, the gap where Jonah should have been walking felt by every single person in that line even, though nobody said his name out loud. The Cade Ranch came into view just past 11, lodge windows lit, smoke rising thin from the chimney, everything arranged with the deceptive calm of a place that looked, from a distance, like any ordinary cattle operation in the territory. Except Hazel knew what sat underneath it. Except she'd lived 2 weeks in the dark beneath those very floorboards, and no amount of lamplight in those windows could scrub that knowledge out of her. Midnight came slow. Then it came all at once, the way waiting always seems to work, nothing, 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 and then suddenly everything moving too fast to track. The gate guards began their shift change exactly, as Silent Crow had described. Old men peeling off toward the bunkhouse, stretching, grumbling, half asleep already. New men arriving, from the lodge, rifles slung careless, over their shoulders, minds clearly still on the warm meal they just left behind. Rosa and Whit moved first, walking straight up the road bold, as anything, Rosa's voice carrying loud enough to be heard. You the outfit hiring extra hands? Fella in Gallows Creek said you'd need bodies, before the week's out. A guard squinted at them, suspicious but tired, the particular tired, that made men careless. Nobody told me about new hires. Ask Duke, then, Whit said, easy, like he had all the patience in the world. We rode 2 hours up here on somebody's word. If it's wrong, that's between you, and whoever sent us. The guard hesitated. Long enough. Just long enough for the argument to pull 2 more men over from the far side of the gate, curious, distracted, exactly the small ordinary chaos the whole plan had been built around. Emmett and Hazel moved, through the gap in the shadow of the fence line, silent, low, while every eye at the gate stayed fixed on Rosa's story, and Whit's easy shrugging. They made it past. Hazel's heart hammered, so hard she was half sure somebody would hear it, over the low murmur of the argument still playing out behind them. They kept to the shadows along the outer buildings, working their way toward the main lodge, and it was there, pressed against the cold wood of a storage shed, waiting for a lamp-carrying guard to pass, that Emmett finally let himself breathe. So far, he whispered. Don't jinx it. Wasn't jinxing. Just saying. Saying it out loud's the same thing, where I come from. A guard passed. Close. Close enough Hazel could smell tobacco on him. Neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed, not really, until his footsteps faded around the corner of the bunkhouse. Then they moved again. The main lodge's side door sat unlocked, smaller entrance, servant's entrance, the kind of door men, who thought themselves untouchable never bothered guarding, as carefully as the front. Emmett eased it open. Slipped inside. Hazel followed, close behind, knife already in hand. The hallway beyond was quiet. Expensive, in the particular gaudy way of men who'd built their fortune on other people's suffering, and tried to disguise it, with imported rugs, and mounted animal heads. Studies this way, Hazel breathed, remembering the layout, from 2 weeks she'd spent trying not to memorize it, and failing entirely. If the ledger's anywhere, it's there. They moved fast now, low, past closed doors, past a room, where laughter carried muffled, through the wood, the sound of men celebrating something, the careless laughter of people, who had no idea their whole world was about to come apart around them. The study door stood slightly ajar. Emmett pushed it open, slow. Empty. Lamp burning low on a heavy desk, papers scattered across it in the disorder of a man too arrogant to think anyone would ever get this far, into his home. Hazel crossed to the desk. Started searching, hands moving fast, careful, while Emmett kept watch at the door. Ledgers, she muttered. Come on. Where? A drawer, locked. She worked her knife, into the seam, same as Emmett had done, with a rifle stock weeks ago, and the lock gave, with a soft crack. Inside sat a heavy leather-bound book, thick with pages, and beside it, folded neat, a stack of letters tied with twine. Hazel opened the ledger. Names. Payments. Dates going back years, meticulous, damning, exactly the kind of proof that could burn down half the corrupt officials in the territory in one clean sweep. And near the bottom of one page, dated 3 years back, a payment listed under the header silencing, Wilder matter. Her stomach dropped straight through the floor. Emmett. He crossed to her. Read the line himself, and something in his face went very, very still. Because there it was. Not speculation. Not grief dressed up as suspicion. Proof, in ink, that Josephine Wilder's death hadn't been an accident at all, that somebody had paid, specifically, deliberately, to make it look like one. Neither of them got to say anything about it. Because that's when the lamp in the hallway went dark, and the door behind them slammed shut, and a voice they both knew far too well spoke, from the shadows near the far wall. Well, Duke Kestrel said, stepping into the remaining light, revolver already raised, a grin spreading slow and ugly across his face. Look who finally came home. Hazel's blood went cold. Because that voice, that exact voice, had been the last thing she'd heard clearly, before the brand touched her skin, and hearing it now, in this room, with a gun pointed steady at both of them, threatened to pull her straight back down, into that basement all over again. You, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. Me. Duke's eyes drifted over her, slow, insulting. Healed up nice. Almost didn't recognize you without the swelling. Still built like a barn door, though. Some things don't change. Duke. Emmett's voice stayed low, controlled, though Hazel could see the tension radiating off him like heat off summer rock. This doesn't have to go. Save it. Duke's grin widened. You know the funny thing, Wilder? I've been waiting on this exact moment for 3 weeks. What are you talking about? You think we didn't know? Duke laughed, short and ugly. You think Ezra just happened to leave a woman alive at Kestrel's post, half-branded, weak enough to crawl, but strong enough to survive the ride out? That was deliberate, Wilder. We knew exactly who'd find her. Knew exactly what kind of man rides 2 hours out of his way for a custom rifle, and can't leave somebody behind, when he finds them instead. Especially somebody her size. Figured that'd tug at you extra hard. Figured you'd think you were being the big hero, saving the poor helpless fat girl nobody else wanted to look twice at. The words landed like a physical blow, and Hazel felt every one of them try to find purchase in old wounds. Felt the flinch start in her chest. Then, deliberately, she let it pass, through her instead of settling. Because that was exactly the kind of thing Duke Kestrel had said to her every single day in that basement, and she'd survived every single one of those days, and she was still standing here breathing, while half his crew was already dead at a river crossing. So this whole time, Hazel said, slow, deliberately drawing his attention, drawing his eyes fully, onto her instead of splitting them between her and Emmett, you've just been waiting. Watching. Letting us think we had the upper hand. Every step, Duke said, delighted with himself. Every plan you two whispered in, that study of his, we already knew was coming, before you finished saying it out loud. Except Amos, Emmett said quietly. Duke's grin flickered, just slightly. What? Amos Tilden. You're inside, man. Emmett's voice had gone dangerously calm. We found him. Locked him up days ago. Which means whatever you thought you still knew about our plans, Duke, that stopped being current information the moment we sat him down in that root cellar. For the first time, real uncertainty crossed Duke's face. And Hazel used it. She moved fast, faster than Duke expected, from a woman he'd spent 2 weeks trying to convince himself she was too much woman to move quick, and knocked the lamp off the desk, with one sweep of her arm. The room plunged into near-total darkness. Duke's shot went wide, splintering wood somewhere behind her. Hazel was already moving, already closing distance, because she'd learned in that basement exactly how dangerous Duke Kestrel was at range, and exactly how much less dangerous he became once you got inside his reach. They collided hard, Duke's revolver clattering away, into the dark, both of them crashing, into the bookshelf, books raining down around them. His hands found her throat. Same as before. Same grip, same terrible familiarity, and for one frozen second Hazel felt herself right back in that basement, helpless, branded, waiting for the pain to start again. Then something in her snapped free of that memory entirely. Because she wasn't that woman anymore. Because weeks of healing, of training, of choosing every single day to survive instead of simply endure, had built something in her that the basement version of herself never had access to. Because every man on that ranch had spent his whole life betting that a woman built the way she was built would tire first, would break first, would be the softer target in any real fight. Duke Kestrel had bet on that too. He was wrong. She drove her knee up, hard, and his grip loosened just enough. Hazel shoved him back, with the full weight and strength of a body that had spent a lifetime being underestimated for exactly this reason, and Duke stumbled into the hearth, and Hazel's hand closed around the iron poker resting against the stones. He lunged at her again, face twisted with fury now instead of amusement. She swung. The iron connected, with a sound she'd remember for the rest of her life, and Duke staggered, blood running from his scalp, disbelief replacing the arrogance that had lived on his face just seconds before. Hazel swung again. And again. All the rage she'd carried, since that basement, since the brand, since every joke about her size, that had ever come out of his mouth, while he held a burning iron an inch from her skin, since watching her brother die, while this exact man smiled about it, she put every ounce of it into those blows, until Duke Kestrel crumpled to the floor, and didn't move again at all. The room went silent except for her own ragged breathing. Emmett was beside her in an instant, hand on her shoulder, steady. Hazel. I'm all right. Her voice shook despite the words. I'm all right. You're sure? She looked down at Duke's body. Felt something complicated settle behind her ribs, not triumph exactly, something quieter, heavier, and true. He's the one, she said. Who did this to me? Her hand drifted, briefly, to the scar under her shirt. He spent 2 weeks telling me my own body was a weakness. Turns out it was the thing that finished him. Except it wasn't done. Not yet. Because somewhere in this lodge, Ezra Cade was still breathing, still running the operation that had killed her brother and Emmett's wife both, and no amount of justice delivered to Duke Kestrel could substitute for finishing what they'd actually come here to finish. They gathered the ledger, the letters, everything from the desk, and moved back toward the door. Except the hallway beyond wasn't empty anymore. Because the gunshot, muffled as it had been, had apparently carried further than either of them hoped, and standing in the corridor, flanked by 2 guards, stood Ezra Cade himself. He looked exactly, as Hazel remembered, from that basement. Calm. Composed. The stillness of a man who'd built an empire on other people's suffering, and never once lost a night's sleep over the cost of it. Well, Ezra said, glancing past them toward Duke's body visible, through the open study door. That's unfortunate. Duke was useful, in his own limited way. Poor manners, though. Never did know how to talk to a woman, without insulting her first. He was a monster, Hazel said. He was employed, Ezra corrected, mild, like the distinction mattered to him more than the accusation ever could. There's a difference, though I don't suppose you're inclined to see it tonight. Ezra Cade. Emmett's voice came out low. Dangerous. 3 years I've been trying to find the man responsible for my wife's death. Took me long enough to understand it was you all along. Your wife, Ezra said, something cold and flat crossing his features, was an inconvenience I dealt, with the way I deal, with all my inconveniences. Efficiently. And without the least bit of hesitation, in case you were hoping I'd tell you it kept me up nights. It didn't. She was trying to save people. She was trying to destroy something, that took me 8 years to build, Ezra said, sharper now, and she nearly succeeded, which is more than I can say for most of the fools who've tried since. I'll say this for you both, though. You've cost me more in 3 weeks than she managed in 3 years. That's almost impressive. Almost. The 2 guards flanking him raised their rifles. You're outnumbered, Ezra said, mild again, like a man discussing the weather. Whatever you found in that desk, whatever you think it proves, it dies here, tonight, along with both of you. I'll build again. Men like me always do. Wrong, Hazel said. Because that's exactly, when the window behind them shattered inward, and Nell Sawyer's voice carried, through the broken glass, shouting the signal they'd agreed on days before, and a heartbeat later the entire west wing of the lodge erupted, into fire and noise, as her charges went off exactly, where Silent Crow's scouting had told them the guards would be thickest. The 2 guards flanking Ezra spun toward the sound, distracted, and in that single half-second of confusion Emmett moved. He crossed the distance fast, closing on the nearest guard, before the man could bring his rifle back around, and the 2 of them went down hard against the hallway floor, grappling for the weapon between them. Hazel turned on the second guard. No knife this time, no poker, just her bare hands, and every ounce of fury she still had left in her, and it was enough. Barely. The guard went down, and didn't get back up. Which left Ezra Cade standing alone in the hallway, watching his empire come apart around him in real time. He didn't run. That surprised Hazel, somehow, even in the chaos of the moment. He simply stood there, composed, reaching slow into his coat. Don't, Emmett said, rifle now in hand, having wrestled it free, from the guard beneath him. Ezra's hand stopped. His mouth curved, thin and unbothered, a man who still believed, even now, that the world owed him one more clever exit. You'll hang for this, he said, almost bored by the thought. One way or another. Maybe, Emmett said. But you won't be alive to see it. His hand moved. Emmett fired before Ezra's fingers ever closed around whatever weapon he'd been reaching for, and the shot took him square in the chest, and Ezra Cade, architect of 8 years of suffering, the man responsible for 2 people's entire worlds collapsing around them, slid down against the hallway wall, and didn't get back up again either. Whatever else the man had been, he died the way he'd lived, without a single word of regret on his lips. The lodge was burning in earnest now, smoke curling thick along the ceiling, the sound of Nell's second charge echoing somewhere out toward the bunkhouse. We need to move, Hazel said, pulling Emmett up by the arm. Now. They ran. The hallway had filled, with smoke thick enough to burn, fire climbing the walls behind them, feeding on old timber, and expensive wallpaper both, with equal hunger. Hazel pulled her collar up, over her mouth, pushed forward blind, through the haze, trusting Emmett's hand on her arm to keep them moving in the right direction. They burst out a side door into chaos. The whole compound had gone up, bunkhouse burning, guards running in every direction, some fighting, most simply fleeing whatever nightmare had descended on their supposedly untouchable operation in the space of 20 minutes. Otis and Silent Crow held the tree line, rifles steady, picking off anyone who came close enough to threaten the retreat. Whit and Rosa emerged, from near the burning bunkhouse, both of them soot-streaked, but alive, herding 2 more freed prisoners they'd found locked in a side shed nobody had mentioned in any of their planning. "This way!" Nell shouted, waving them toward the horses. They ran for the tree line, bullets kicking up dirt behind them, and somewhere in the chaos Hazel caught sight of a figure sprinting for the stables, Abel Cade, unmistakable even at a distance, abandoning his dying brother's empire, without a single backward glance. "Abel's running," she shouted. Silent Crow was already turning, rifle coming up smooth, and unhurried, the way it always came up, like the whole world had slowed down just for him. He fired once. Abel Cade went down mid-stride, 20 yards short of the stable door, and didn't rise again. Hazel felt something settle in her chest at the sight of it, the last piece of a promise she'd made in a guest room weeks ago, finally, completely kept. Ezra. Duke. Abel. All 3, exactly as she'd sworn. "That's all of them," she said, breathless. "Emmett." "That's all 3. He didn't answer right away. Just nodded once, hard, and kept running toward the horses. They reached them. Mounted fast. Rode hard away, from the burning ranch, the glow of it lighting the sky behind them long, after the sounds of gunfire had finally faded, into distance and silence. They didn't stop, until dawn broke gray, and cold over unfamiliar hills, everybody accounted for, everybody alive, the ledger and letters secure in Emmett's saddlebag along, with whatever justice those pages were about to deliver to half the corrupt officials in the territory. Hazel sat by a small fire, as the sun came up, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle slow, into her bones. Emmett sat down beside her. "You did that," he said quietly. "Back there. With Duke. I know what I did. How do you feel?" Hazel was quiet a long moment, turning the question over honestly instead of reaching for whatever answer might sound cleaner. "Tired," she said finally. "Not sorry. Just tired." She looked at him. "Is that wrong?" "No," Emmett said. "That's about the most honest thing anybody said to me in 3 years." They rode back, into Stonebrook 2 days later, exhausted, wounded in small ways, that would heal, carrying evidence heavy enough to bring down half the crooked officials in the territory. Amos Tilden was waiting, when they arrived, and the moment he saw the saddlebag Emmett carried, something in his face shifted. "Is it done?" he asked. "Ezra's dead," Emmett said. "Duke's dead. Abel's dead. All of it, over." Amos let out a breath, that seemed to come, from somewhere very deep. Then, quiet, he led them to the small room off the freight office, where he'd kept the ranch's books for 6 years, and from beneath a loose floorboard he pulled out the thin bundle of letters he'd already told Hazel about, copies, in his own careful handwriting, of every schedule and route he'd ever passed along to the ring. "I sent copies to the governor's office 3 months ago," he said, voice shaking. "Anonymous, so they couldn't trace it back to my family. Everything I knew about the ring's operations, their routes, their contacts inside the sheriff's office. I didn't know if it would ever matter. Didn't know if anybody would even read it." Hazel and Emmett exchanged a look. "The governor's office already has this," Emmett said, disbelief coloring his voice. "Has had it 3 months," Amos confirmed. "I don't expect that to undo anything, Mr. Wilder. I know what I cost you. I know it doesn't balance out." His voice broke slightly. "I just needed you to know I tried to fix some small piece of it, even while I was still too scared to stop the rest." Emmett studied him a long moment. "It's not forgiveness," he said finally. "What you did, what it cost, that doesn't just wash away, because you got scared enough, eventually, to do one decent thing. But it matters. Whatever comes next, this will matter, when it's weighed." Amos nodded, tears finally falling freely now, months of fear and shame breaking loose all at once. Governor Aldous Whitfield arrived at Stonebrick 11 days later, a compact man well into his 60s, sharp-eyed, carrying himself like someone who'd spent his whole career being underestimated, and had learned to use that underestimation as a weapon. He'd been elected on promises of cleaning up territorial corruption, and had spent most of his term frustrated by exactly how deep that corruption actually ran. Now, finally, with the ledger, and Amos's letters both in hand, he had proof thick enough to matter. This is the most extensive corruption case this territory has ever seen, he told them, in a study crowded with federal marshals and a journalist from a Kansas City paper. 6 judges facing indictment. 14 marshals. Sheriff Cross among them. It should have been torn apart years ago, Emmett said. Whitfield's eyes moved to Hazel. Miss Merrick. Your testimony would carry significant weight. I'll testify, Hazel said. But understand something, Governor. My story isn't entertainment. I'll give you the facts. I won't give anybody my grief to gawk at. Whitfield studied her a long moment, something like respect crossing his weathered face. Understood, he said. Facts will be more than enough. The trial stretched across the better part of a year. Sheriff Wyatt Cross was convicted first, on evidence pulled directly from Ezra Cade's ledger, sentenced to 15 years for corruption and conspiracy both. Judge after judge followed, official after official, the whole rotten network. Emmett and Josephine had both spent years trying to expose, finally collapsing under the weight of proof nobody could argue away. Hazel testified twice, sitting in the witness box both times, and answering every question, with the same flat, unshakable honesty, refusing every attempt by defense attorneys to twist her grief into something they could use against her. Amos Tilden received a reduced sentence for his cooperation, and when it was served, Emmett gave him the freight books back, on different terms, no secrets, no debts hidden in shadow, just an old man trying, slow and imperfect, to spend whatever years he had left making up for the ones he'd cost other people. Kestrel's post sat empty for months, after Silas Kestrel's death, nobody quite sure what to do with a building that had seen so much blood. Then, one morning in early spring, nearly a year after the fire, Hazel rode out there alone. She stood in the doorway a long while, looking at the space where she'd once crouched behind crates of ammunition, waiting to die, or worse, before a stranger, with kind eyes and scarred hands had kicked the door in, and changed the entire shape of her life. Emmett found her there an hour later. Thought I might find you out here, he said, dismounting. Been thinking about this place. Good thoughts or bad ones? Both. Hazel turned to face him. I want to rebuild it. Not as a trading post. As something else. A place for people like the ones we pulled out of that wagon. People who need somewhere safe to land, while they figure out what comes next. She paused. I want to name it after Eli. Something moved across Emmett's face, quiet and understanding. Eli's Landing, he said, testing the name. Something like that. I'll fund it, Emmett said immediately. Whatever you need. I know you will. Hazel's voice softened, just slightly. That's not why I'm asking. I know that too. They rebuilt it that spring and into summer. New timber over old bones, a fresh roof, rooms added on the back, where the storeroom had once been, rooms meant for healing instead of hiding, for safety instead of survival. Agnes ran the place once it opened. Otis stayed on to teach skills to those who wanted them. Rosa split her time between Stonebrick and Eli's Landing, both, teaching newly rescued women the quiet confidence she'd spent years building for herself. Nell moved on eventually, chasing some new cause in a different territory, though she wrote occasionally, brief letters full of dry humor. Hazel visited her brother's grave often, that first year, though less often, as time went on, not because she'd forgotten him, but because she no longer needed to stand over cold earth to feel connected to what he'd meant to her. She wore his coat still, on cold mornings, and told his stories to the frightened new arrivals at Eli's Landing, when they asked why the place carried his name. "He stood up for me once," she told them, always the same simple truth, when it would have been easier not to. "This place is built on that." One evening in late autumn, Hazel found Emmett on the porch at Stonebrick, looking out at land he'd built, with his own 2 hands, and rebuilt, in some deeper sense, alongside her these past months. "What happens now?" she asked. "For you?" Emmett considered the question a long moment. "I keep building," he said finally. "Same as I always have. Except now it means something different than it used to." "And Eli's Landing?" "Grows," Emmett said. "As long as there's people who need somewhere safe to land, it grows." Hazel looked out at the darkening valley, at the lights of Stonebrick glowing warm against the coming night, at a life that had started in the worst room she'd ever stood in, and had somehow, against every reasonable odd, become this instead. "I used to think," she said quietly, "that surviving was the whole point. Get through it. Stay alive. That's all I let myself want, back in that basement." She glanced at him. "Turns out surviving was just the beginning of something bigger. And I used to think my size was the first thing anybody ever saw, when they looked at me. The thing that made men underestimate me, before I'd said a single word. Took me a long time to understand it was never the weakness they thought it was." "It never was," Emmett said. "Not to me. Not from the first morning I found you." Hazel didn't answer right away. Just sat there beside him, watching the last light fade off the ridgeline, feeling the peace of a debt finally settled, and a promise finally kept. Somewhere down in the valley, a bell rang for evening supper. New arrivals would be at Eli's Landing tonight, frightened, hurt, needing exactly the kind of help that money alone could never fully provide. The work would go on. It always did. But for this one quiet evening, sitting on a porch that had once been nothing but stone and stubborn grass, Hazel Merrick let herself simply be still. Not because everything was fixed. It never fully would be. But because she'd learned, the hard way, in the worst room of her life, and every difficult day since, that peace was never really the absence of pain. It was the presence, finally, of purpose. And she'd found hers in the last place she ever expected to look, standing beside a mountain of a man who'd once ridden down out of the high country for nothing more than a custom rifle, and found, instead, the rest of his life waiting for him in the dark.